So let's continue. So what do we see so far? We saw so far that Yud K, the two first letters of God's name, which are wisdom and understanding, they are called the secrets, right? So anything that's wisdom and understanding is relatively a secret. We said that in Chassidus it's explained that this is because no one else can know what you're thinking.
Don't we have the ability to understand the secrets?
Yeah, of course. But it's just that no one else is privileged to what's going on in your mind. So that's secretive in that sense. As opposed to the lower sphirot, the emotions and the habits, that they are revealed. In fact, they don't develop unless you have an other to develop them with. So the
wise man can look at a person's face and understand what he's thinking about.
No, you can't look at a person's face and understand what he's thinking about. You can understand the emotions that he has, but you can't understand what he's thinking. You can't know what he's thinking about. To be able to know what he's thinking about, you have to have telepathy. That's something else, and that nobody has.
Intuition is not enough.
What?
Intuition.
Intuition is it's what we call the ta'alumot lev. It's what's called in the Tanya the secrets of the heart. Intuition is about the heart. It's not about the mind. You can't know what somebody else is thinking. So the secret of the intercalation is called a secret because in the Torah it's described as the wisdom and the understanding in face of the nations. That the nations see that this is something that is special with the Jewish people in terms of their knowledge. We said that the Rambam says something like that.
You have a hint of it in yesterday's Chittas. Hashem said to Moshe Rabbeinu, this is going to be Rosh Chodesh.
Right.
Moshe said,
that's
what you're talking about. Show me the picture
right.
of the
Right. To show him. I actually had to show him what it looks like. V'hainu, kishar chakei Torah bezun, as we said, the rest of the Torah, which is not the secret part, is in zun, is in the lower sfirot, and ikreim niglot. So this we read, right? והיינו, חלק הניגלה לתורה הוא הבחינת התורה שנקרא נובלות חוכמה. It's a very important thing that in the Medrash it says, and we actually mentioned it in Pirkei Avos also, נובלות חוכמה שלמעלה תורה. That the droppings, even, I don't know how to translate novlot better, but it's what comes down from the low-hanging fruit of the Torah is the Torah above, is the Torah that we have below. And that's a very important concept in Kabbalah and in Chassidus. The concept is pretty simple. It's saying that the Torah that we have, like we discussed in the first part of the week, the Torah that we have had to go through some kind of contraction. Because how do you fit something that's infinite, God, into something that's finite?
Conduit.
You can't do it. You have to go through something.
A conduit.
You have to find some way to contract it. So it's a conduit or something else. And in this case, it was Moshe Rabbeinu. But what about that Torah that remained above? The source from which everything emanated, from which the fruit came, the low-hanging fruit is, again, as a metaphor, is what we have in our Torah. Can you get to that original Torah? Is it really? The hint for it is in the book of Samuel, where there's a pasuk that says, "Kasher yomar mashal kadmoni," as the ancient metaphor would say, "L'rashayim mirashayim yetzeh resha." That from the evil comes evil. What's this ancient metaphor? What are you talking about? So I don't know what Samuel or David there was talking about. But the way it's explained, I don't know what the literal meaning of what they wanted to say was. Was there some ancient tradition that they had from before the time of the Torah or not? And they called it Mashal HaKadmoni, the ancient metaphor. But in any case, in Kabbalah and Chassidut, it's taken as a sign, as a verse that's talking about this primordial Torah. We wrote a lot about it, about this topic in the book that I wrote with Rav Ginsburg about Torah and science. Why? Because in Rav Isaac there's a very far-reaching explanation, and he says that when we say that all that is in reality, including what science has uncovered about nature, is in the Torah, we don't mean the Torah that we have in front of us. Because in the Torah that we have in front of us, you can just get a hint of it. But to actually see it, the way that a scientist would understand it, you would have to see the original primordial Torah. He says that primordial Torah was before the world was created. That's the Chokhmah and Bina. But not the Chokhmah and Bina that we have, that talks about wisdom and understanding in the revealed way. In the way that when you learn Shas, you use your wisdom and your understanding. The way you learn Talmud, you use your wisdom and understanding. That's already the Novlot Chokhmah Shelemala. That's already the low-hanging fruit. You have to get back to the root itself, the primordial Torah itself. There's no split between what science would call knowledge and what the Torah calls knowledge. There, the divine wisdom and the mundane wisdom that science studies are all the same. They're all one. Another place that this is mentioned is in terms of the second day of creation. The second day of the creation, God separated the waters. So in the Zohar, the separation of the waters is described as splitting the primordial Torah into two. It just doesn't say what the two represent. Later on, there's a parish on the Zohar called the Shmoret HaBoker, and he writes that the split between the higher waters and the lower waters is like the difference between the divine wisdom of the Torah, that's the higher waters, and the lower wisdom of science, or of uncovering what's in the mundane world, studying the mundane world, that's the lower waters. And the difference between them is very clear, that the lower waters, God is concealed. The contraction is such that you can't see God at all. You can study science from now to the end of the world, you won't find God inside. And what you'll find is an allusion to God. It's alluding to it. It's pointing at it, but it can't show God Himself, because the contraction there, as we discussed many times, is one of concealment. But in the Torah, when you study the divine wisdom, there you encounter Hashem Himself. You encounter God Himself, because the contraction there was to take the infinite and bring it into the finite.
I always understood there's only one Torah, one eternal Torah from beginning to end.
Oh.
And just a question of how you understand it, where you are, where you're holding. But the Torah itself hasn't changed. The understanding of the Torah in the higher worlds is much deeper than the understanding of Torah in our world.
It's not a different book. It's the same book.
So you're talking about it as if it's a different book.
No. I meant it's the same book, obviously. But like the Ramban writes in the introduction to his commentary in the Chumash, it could be that it's divided differently. That the letters are divided into different words. It's the same letters. Okay? We talked about this in relation to Moshe Rabbeinu writing the last 8 verses. The Baal Shem Tov says Bidema means like Demai, that it's mixed up. That he only wrote the letters, and Yoshua came and he ordered them into words and verses. So that's another possibility. There are different ways of saying this. In the end, what you're saying is that there is a higher unity of knowledge in the world. And the Torah that we have, the revealed Torah, think about what it meant to learn Torah 600 years ago, 1,000 years ago. There was no Chassidus yet. Even Kabbalah was just beginning to be revealed. So there may have been people who were very adept at it and knew a lot of the principles. But in the end, until the Arizal came along, so if the Ramban knew what he knew, it's incomparable to what the Arizal revealed. Because it's a whole higher level of depth of understanding of this primordial Torah. And that's the Nister. That's the understanding. The Nister still studies the same text. The hidden secrets of the Torah still come from the same verses. It's just a higher understanding.
When you study your physics, then you look at that table and you realize that the table is basically made up of all sorts of particles flying around, and really and truthfully it's 99% space. But then you can appreciate Hashem. You come to understand Hashem from the secrets of science.
If you believe that there is a Shem, that there is a Shem, you can say that this is pointing at it. You can't say that this is revealing God. If anything, again, it's concealing, because the whole purpose of science is to study matter, is to study the revealed reality. And the revealed reality conceals Hashem. That's just its nature. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just how Hashem built the world. It's not that it did something wrong, and because it's concealing. In the future, it'll reveal also. When Hashem decides that the material world should reveal Him, it will reveal Him. Meaning, in other words, you will find a new law of nature that talks about the infinite coming into the finite. There will have to be some law like that. There's no law exactly like that right now. There's laws that are a little bit like that. And in fact, one of the interesting things that you could say in positively about what Einstein did. We talked about this. Einstein, the Rebbe very much didn't like the fact that Einstein decided that the speed of light was limited. That it's
spoke about that?
Yeah, we've talked about it. It's a constant. You can't go any faster. The Rebbe didn't like that. He said that's not how empirical science works. You can't just decide. You can't pull out of a hat this decision.
But did he agree or disagree?
He disagreed with it.
He disagreed.
He disagreed. But he didn't disagree necessarily with the statement. Maybe if we continue to measure the speed of light again and again and again and again, we'll slowly be convinced that, yes, the speed of light is constant under all inertial frames of reference. We might be. That's how you do empirical science. And you say in the end that you have a conjecture that the speed of light is always the same. But if once in a while you find that it's not, you're not flabbergasted. You say, okay, most of the time it's the same, some of the time it's not. So I had a whole discussion about this once, about why the Rebbe also didn't like it, because it wants to make everybody equal. It's democracy. And not everybody's equal in a certain sense, because there is a center to the world. And democracy is no center to the world. Anyway, so when you do look at one of the things that Einstein did, is he came close to saying there's infinite within the finite. In what sense? In the sense that he had to find hidden energy in matter. And so he claimed, and this is how the atomic bomb was basically produced afterwards, he claimed that within the bonds, not at the level of not the chemical bonds, but the nuclear bonds, between the particles, there's so much energy stored that if you break apart the bonds, then this energy will be released. Where does this energy normally go? So the simple answer is it goes to taking the particle through time. It's a whole geschäft in nuclear physics, in quantum physics. But it means basically that to move through time, you have to expend energy. So that's where the energy is normally going. But sometimes so there's a whole question that comes up. So does that mean that if you would increase the energy a lot, you could go through time more quickly? Theoretically, yes. And if you reduce the mass, you could go backwards in time? That's also true. There's all kinds of things that come out of that. So there's beginning to be a sense that maybe time is not unidirectional. Maybe matter contains a lot more than what we see that it contains. And the opposite of what you said. What you said is that matter is empty. But that's not how a physicist would see it. The physicist would say, it's not that matter is empty, that there's a lot of energy here. And the energy is what's really interesting. It's not the emptiness. Emptiness we're not very interested in. So where's all this energy being stored? How is it being stored? In what way can you access it, and so on? So those are questions that begin to look a little bit like what Torah says, that the infinite is within the finite. But of course, as much as you look within matter, in the end, matter is senseless. It's consciousnessless. There's nothing there. It's just matter. Energy, matter, it's all the same. And the Torah picture is very different. That everything that is going on is very aware. Okay? That Hashem is constantly aware of everything. So we talked about the different levels of awareness when we talked about Aggadah, and the Maimer we didn't learn this year, we learned 2 years ago or 1 year ago on Shmos, that Vayedai Elokim, what it means that God knew finally that they were suffering. What are those levels of consciousness? What do they mean? So there are levels of consciousness that God knows the world, okay, because He decided that that's how He would work. But at a basic level, permeating everything is godly consciousness, that God knows everything that there is. And that there's no physical description of, and there probably will never be. I can't see it happening. I don't see how it'll really play out. Something fundamental has to change in the way that scientists see the world, and that will only happen when Hashem decides to reveal Himself. And it could be that we're working with that anyway. So some people will come and say, "Why would you even want to describe it mathematically? Well, what good will come out of it? Because prayer works because Hashem is conscious of everything that's happening. You don't have to show me a physical law for it. I don't care, really, if you could mathematize it or not. Maybe you can't. Maybe you can't even mathematize these revadim. How do you say revadim? These inner dimensions of reality. Maybe they're not mathematizable at all in the first place, quantitative. Anyway. So the whole Torah that we talk about, Nevolot Chochmah, hu b'chinat haTorah kmo she'yarda bezun, v'hu b'chinat hashamayim kisi, and that's what we call that the heavens are my chair, my throne. What does it mean, a throne? Why is the heavens described as a throne? Because to get to the throne, you sit on it. You lower yourself. So that's another metaphor for the higher state of godliness coming down. In the same way that you say that the Torah came down, that the low-hanging fruit is the Torah that we learn down here. Again, the nigla of Torah, the revealed tradition of Torah. And it's explained in length. It's the first mimer. It's the very first mimer in Torah Or. Right? He starts with this. The first thing, we've learned it, but... So the first mimer, he talks about the fact that all the Torah that we have is just Hashem sitting on His throne. So where's the rest? Where is it when He's standing up? That was not revealed yet. And where is it when He's standing up? It's conserved in one place, he says, in the Chochmah and Bina. In the mind, the king, whether he's standing up or sitting down, for his mind is the same. In fact, what it does is, it brings the mind closer to the rest of the lower body. That's what sitting down means. That's what he describes in the first mimer. That when you sit down, you bring the mind, the Chochmah and Bina, down. And that's what's called Novlot Chochmah Shel Ma'alat Torah, the Torah that we have, the Nigla Torah, because it's Torah that was enclothed and garbed in halacha, in the way that we learn in Shas, in the Talmud. It doesn't mean, by the way, for a moment, that the mitzvos would be interpreted differently. Meaning, you could say almost that though Kabbalah certainly gives symbolic meaning to the mitzvos, it doesn't for a second say you don't have to do the mitzvos. Because even when you sit down, your body should still work the same. It doesn't matter. If your digestion would stop every time you would sit down, nobody would sit down. You can't run your life that way. The real, I should have said, when you stand up, your digestion would stop, so nobody would be able to live. The world continues the same way. You still have to do the same mitzvos, even when you have a higher symbolic interpretation of their meaning. But the acts are still the same acts. The body still has to work the same way. As we said many times, the mitzvahs are like the body of the Torah. And the halachic discussion, that's like the mind of it. But the mind has come down to be able to engarb itself in worldly matters. When you learn Chassidus and you learn Kabbalah, really you're learning the mind as it is when Hashem is standing up in the world of Atzilus, right? The world of creation is called the world of the throne. And that's another one, we talked about this many times, that the world of the throne is really the world of physical laws. It's also the world that Hashem inhabits, as it were, when He comes down to give us the revealed tradition. It's called the throne, the world of creation, where you sit. And so on, as he explains in Tanya. This is the Torah as it comes down into the halachic discussion that something is permitted, something is forbidden, and so on. What is the secrets of the Torah? Where were they written down? So they were written in Aggadah. Aggadah, meaning the mashal, meaning the what people call the homiletic or hermeneutic drush, that's either in the Shas or in the Midrashim, wherever it is, in the Zohar is basically a Midrash. That is the Torah that in its pristine state above. That's the hidden, concealed Torah. And that is the Torah that preceded the world, meaning preceded these 6,000 years, as the sages call it. Again, this is another one of these terrible things, that people are stuck on this number 6,000 like it's some kind of literal number. It may actually turn out that it's true, but that wasn't the purpose of it. When Rabbi Zira says in the Gemara, in Yuma, I think it is, Avodah Zarah and Daf Tet, he says that Shit Alfei Shnin Have Alma, that the world will be for 6,000 years. So he's some kind of timekeeper. What is he? What he has nothing to do in his life except to make crazy suppositions. No, he's talking about a correlation between the 6 days of creation and the fact that the world is a revelation of Hashem in the midos, in the 6 emotive and habitual sfirot, and that's what we have in this world. That's what this world is about. When I say that the Torah came 2,000 years before the world, so I mean that you have to count to minus 2,000? Not at all. I mean that it's wisdom and understanding which are above the revelation of this lower world, which is this number 6, connected to this number 6. In fact, will we have 6,000 years of history? Will we not have 6,000 years of history? It's immaterial. It's not important. It's just not relevant. If you think that way, you'll never finish. If you think that you have to go through 6,000 years of history for the Mashiach to come, that was like one of the questions that people used to ask the Rebbe. We have 250 years to go, 260 years to go, 270 years to go, whenever he started. How you're dochek taketz. You're trying to bring the end before it's time.
What did the Rebbe say to
that? It almost like, what does it sound like? It sounds like my son saying to me, Tati, don't take out too much money from the ATM because you'll finish all the money in the bank. Something, it's just childish understanding.
But how did the Rebbe handle it?
How can you handle these things?
What did he say?
What can you say to these things? What do you say to a child? How do you truly explain to them that the money is nominal? It's just a symbol of something. You can print more if you need it, and the bank, the money isn't sitting there in vaults. And how do you even explain that we only have $37 trillion in fiat currency and 1,250 trillion in derivatives and instruments and whatever else, and they've never been printed and they never will be printed, and there's numbers on a computer? How do you explain that? Either you chop it or you don't chop it. You either get it or you don't get it. There's no two ways. I don't know. How do you make a person understand the significance of something abstract? I mean, that's what we talked about with Avram. That Avram had to invent coinage to take people out of the world of sheep and goats, where everything was even more concrete. It was even more. They even less could understand the power of abstraction. The whole story of humanity, in the end, of the mind, the understanding of humanity, psychology, everything, is of increased abstraction. That people need. You can't understand Hashem otherwise. You can't understand Torah otherwise. You have to learn how to abstract. And if you can't do that because Hashem is not concrete, that's the whole issue. How do you get people to understand God who cannot be seen? He's not concrete, and yet He's everything. That's a real problem. The abstraction, maybe today people don't have a big problem with. Maybe they've begun to understand. To some extent. Again, you'll get people really stuck on this 6,000 years. I'm not saying for a moment that the world wasn't created in 6 days. It was. Okay. Why? Because the Torah says so, and it learns a mitzvah out of it. So you
have to keep Shabbos.
You have to keep Shabbos. How does that work? You're right, I'm stumped. I can't explain it. I can't explain it at all. So, Rabbi Ginsburg has in his book on evolution a very good explanation. But he himself told me that this was in his mind in the end turning somersaults in the air to try to make it work. It's not simple. Even in his mind, it's not simple. It's not simple to explain it. But it works. I think the explanation is pretty good. He thinks it's not so great, but I think it's pretty good. So,
where's it printed?
It's a book called, it's his lectures on evolution that he gave many years ago.
Hebrew or English?
It's in English, actually.
You have it?
Mm-hmm. I think you'll like it. It's a very interesting explanation.
Yeah, I'd like to read it.
Okay. Because our reality is vak, is the 6 extremes, the 6 emotive and habitual sfirot, and they're called the measurements. Midot are measurements, basically, because it's measured. It's limited. And the Torah, which is higher, that came 2,000 years before reality as a word, that we're talking about wisdom and understanding. And it's a pasuk in Eov that's extended. The pasuk just says, Alefcha Chochma. But the sages turned it into Alefcha Chochma. I will teach you wisdom, I will teach you understanding also. There's a whole story about why they added this part of the verse that's not in Eov. This whole verse is in Eov 33. And so they added this. So there it's talking about wisdom and understanding, these 2,000 years. Vezeu, says the Rebbe's father, she'en shonin Aggadah l'gasei ruach u'miutei Torah. You can't teach Aggadah, which is talking about the abstract, to people who are too concrete. They're too coarse. So he's saying the same thing that the Rambam afterwards said in his introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim. He says, Rambam was the first step, like Kabbalah, but discussing rationally the problem of abstraction. The whole first part of Moreh Nevuchim is about understanding the abstraction you have to go through in learning Torah in order to understand, in his time, philosophy. For him, philosophy was the highest achievement at the time. To abstract the Torah to get to science as we know it today requires a lot more abstraction. Like we just said, about just to understand how can you understand timelines of billions of years without abstraction? It's almost impossible. You have to be able to abstract. Again, and at the same time keep your cake. You got to eat it and keep it at the same time, because the Torah does talk about 6 days. So you've got this hafachim, you've got these paradoxes going on. So to abstract the person to paradox, how many people have really studied paradox? I remember that one of the most influential books that I had in my teenage years was Gedel Escher Bach, The Eternal Golden Braid. And Douglas Hofstadter wrote that book. It was the best, it won a Pulitzer. It's popular science about the most unpopular subject in the world, paradoxes. And he was able to explain to, well, I had a lot of computer background, so I think that helped me, but he was able to explain to a regular layperson who was willing to chip away at this book, it's a huge book, who was able to explain Escher's conjecture, or Escher's, Gödel's theorem. Kurt Gödel was probably one of the greatest mathematicians ever at a whole different level. And he had a theorem that proved that mathematics was an incomplete system. Meaning there were theorems, there were statements of fact, as it were, that you could show that they're factual within mathematics that are unprovable. That though you know that they're true, you can't use mathematics to prove that they're true. That is, I can say that statement, I don't know what it means to somebody today, but without that book, at the time that was the only grasp I had of the subject, I wouldn't have been able to understand paradox. Because really, after that, you get into Russell and Whitehead and their work and Cantor's work, and there's a lot of levels to this understanding of paradox. Chassidus is entirely about paradox. The whole beginning of Derech Emunah what's called Sefer HaChakirah from the Tzemach Tzedek, the whole beginning is the study of paradox in Torah. And we know that who was the master of paradox? The master of paradox was King Solomon. And how do Chazal capture that he was the master of paradox? Because he could show you a paradox. It wasn't just that he could explain it. He could actually show it. He could physically show it to you. And what did he do? He created the temple. He built it. And in the temple, he placed the Aron Kodesh. And you had this paradoxical reality in which the Aron is there. You can see it. But when you measure it to side, you see that it doesn't take up any space. And that is the father of all paradoxes in the physical world. And this was his genius, that I can show you a paradox.
The Kodesh Baruch Hu built the temple with him.
Said when you say that, what you mean is that he was able to tap into this aspect of Hashem that allowed this paradox to be shown. We know that.
I have the bench and go.
Yeah, so just one more sentence. We know that he was so interested in paradox because what was the famous statement that he says? Amarti achkema vehi rechoka mimeni. I said I will grow wise, and it remains distant from me. He was talking about the paraduma, about the red heifer. Mm-hmm. That he said he couldn't understand how he couldn't understand this paradox. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't give you a good example of it. That how is it possible that the person who takes the ashes and he squirts it on the person he becomes impure, and the person that was impure became pure. So there's been all kinds of attempts to explain it since then, but that's not the point. He wasn't trying to explain it logically, because you can explain paradox logically. You can take it to different. He was trying to show it. He was trying to show it in the same way that he was able to show in the temple this idea of space being paradoxical. He also wanted to show that time was paradoxical. He wanted to show that soul was paradoxical. That was the main thing that he was really after. And his flirtations with paradox, we talked about this got him in trouble with Ashmadai, with the master. And he himself went through a paradoxical state called dissociative disorder. And he became two people. And he couldn't fully integrate them into one. Okay, so I guess this will be enough. But tomorrow I will try to make time. I will do my very best so that we can learn at 9. Because I'd like to finish this. There's not much more. There's only another page.
Extremely interesting.